They called it the tank that saved a nation, the unstoppable steel beast that crushed the Nazi war machine. But behind the glory, behind the red banners and the victory parades, lies a truth far darker than propaganda ever dared to admit. More than half of the 80,000 T-34s ever built were destroyed. Tens of thousands burned with their crews still trapped inside. They were told it was invincible. They were told it was the pride of the motherland. But inside that cramped, suffocating hull, death waited in silence. No radios, no escape hatches, no mercy. A machine forged in fear, built in haste, and driven by men who knew they would never return. It was the Soviet Union's greatest weapon and its most efficient executioner. This is not the story you were taught in history class. This is the story of how victory was built on the ashes of its own soldiers. For decades, the T-34 was worshipped as a symbol of Soviet strength, a miracle of steel and fire, the machine that turned the tide of the Second World War. In the grand museums of Moscow, it sits proudly under spotlights, paint gleaming, turret raised like a monument to victory. Children climb on its tracks, veterans salute its silhouette, and in the textbooks, it is described with one word, invincible, but legends have a way of hiding their scars. Behind the polished stories of heroism, the truth lay buried under layers of myth and fear. The T-34 was not born from engineering brilliance alone. It was born from terror, secrecy, and desperation. Its designer, Mikhail Koshkin, worked under the constant shadow of Stalin's purges. A single mistake could mean prison or death. Factories were ordered to build faster, cheaper, regardless of how many lives it cost. It was not just a tank, it was a Soviet dream of dominance hammered into metal by trembling hands. At first glance, the machine seemed flawless. Sloped armor, unheard of at the time, could deflect shells that tore through other tanks. A 76mm gun promised devastating power. Its diesel engine, rugged, reliable, a symbol of Soviet ingenuity, seemed to prove that communism could outbuild the West. To the soldiers on the front lines, the T-34 became a legend before it even reached the battlefield. Propaganda films called it the steel guardian of the motherland. Radio broadcasts claimed German bullets bounced off its armor like raindrops. It was, as the party declared, proof that Soviet science had conquered fear itself. But when the first tanks rolled into battle, the myth began to crumble. Crews soon discovered that invincible was just a word. Inside, the air was choking with oil fumes. The driver sat half-blind, peering through a slit barely wider than his fist. The commander had no cupola, no radio, no clear vision of the battlefield. The gunner had to load and fire while the man beside him shouted orders over the roar of the engine. Each shot rattled the hull like a thunderclap inside a coffin of steel. Still, the myth grew. Each photograph of a victorious crew was printed 1,000 times. Each destroyed tank was quietly erased from the record. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, the truth was dangerous, failure was treason. And so the T-34 became a story, not a machine. A weapon of faith more than of war. By the winter of 1941, as German forces closed on Moscow, the legend was all that kept hope alive. Soviet radio called it the fist of the people. Posters showed it crushing swastikas beneath its treads. To question its perfection was to question the motherland itself. But on the frozen fields of the Eastern Front, thousands of those so-called perfect machines burned. Their crews never escaped. The photographs never showed that part. The truth of what happened inside those tanks remained locked behind steel and silence. Because history remembers victory, but it rarely remembers what victory costs. When 1941 turned into winter, the Soviet Union was bleeding steel. 20,000 tanks lost in a single year. Entire divisions erased before they ever saw victory. But Stalin did not mourn machines or men. He demanded more. More tanks, more factories, more silence. As German armies pushed east, Soviet industry fled into the shadows. Factories were torn apart, loaded onto trains, and sent beyond the Ural Mountains. Women, children, and old men followed them into the cold. They slept beside furnaces, working 20-hour shifts by the light of molten steel. Frost gathered on their faces as sparks burned holes in their coats. They built tanks the way others prayed, endlessly, desperately, without pause. Precision no longer mattered. Seats were optional. Paint was a luxury. Rubber for the wheels was replaced with bare steel. Sometimes even the bolts didn't fit. But the party called it efficiency. The workers called it survival. Every morning, another T-34 rolled off the line. Every night, another shipment of bodies came back from the front. The numbers became their only shield. Where one tank was destroyed, 10 more appeared. Where 10 men fell, 50 were drafted. It was a war fought by arithmetic, not strategy. Each T-34 cost less than a coffin, and filled one just as well. Stalin's war machine had learned that victory could be mass-produced. The propaganda never stopped. Posters showed women welding under red banners, smiling through exhaustion. Headlines praised the invincible tank of the people. But the truth was simpler. They were producing tanks faster than they could bury their dead. The command was absolute. Quantity is our quality, a phrase that condemned thousands to die inside a myth. In the offices of Moscow, officials celebrated record quotas. They spoke of progress, of revolution, of a future built on steel. But those who worked the furnaces knew better. They saw children coughing black dust, hands trembling from cold and fear. They saw engineers arrested for questioning defects. They saw entire trains of tanks leave the factory half finished, their fates already sealed. Every plate, every rivet, every weld was signed in human blood. The front demanded tanks faster than truth could travel. Commanders wrote glowing reports, terrified to admit what they saw. A tank that broke down was sabotage. A tank that burned was heroic resistance. The lie became policy. The truth became treason. And so, the myth of the T-34 grew stronger than the men who drove it. By 1943, production had doubled. At the height of the war, 1,200 tanks a month rolled from Soviet assembly lines. They were no longer machines, they were symbols, stamped with numbers instead of names. Every one of them carried the same destiny: to burn, to kill, to vanish. And as long as the trains kept moving, the illusion of victory remained intact. When the Red Army finally began to push west, its power came not from superiority, but from exhaustion made infinite. Each offensive was fueled by bodies, not fuel. Each victory was paid in thousands of silent deaths. The Soviet Union had turned its people into ammunition. The T-34 was the shell that carried them. It did not matter if they broke, it only mattered that they reached Berlin. This was the price of numbers. A victory built not on brilliance or technology, but on the willingness to drown the enemy in endless sacrifice. The propaganda called it glory, history called it triumph, but for those who built and died inside the T-34, it was something else entirely. It was proof that even miracles can be manufactured, if you're willing to feed them enough blood. It began long before the first shell was fired. In the late 1920s, the Soviet Union was racing against time. Stalin's vision was clear: an empire of steel, powered by fear and fueled by human sacrifice. Factories rose from frozen ground. Smoke poured from chimneys that never slept. The Red Army was to be rebuilt from nothing, armed with machines that could conquer the future. The tank was not just a weapon, it was the heart of the new Soviet mythology. It would symbolize progress, control, and industrial rebirth. But to build it, the Soviets had to steal, borrow, and adapt from the West. They bought British Vickers tanks. They copied American Christie suspension systems. And in hidden workshops outside Kharkov, engineers began forging something new. Something Stalin demanded must be unstoppable. Mikhail Koshkin, a man of fragile health but iron will, was chosen to design it. He called it the A-20 at first, a fast, lightly armored prototype built for speed. But war was coming, and speed would not be enough. The lessons of Spain, of Finland, of Lake Hassan all screamed one truth: Soviet armor was too weak, too light, too late. Koshkin's answer was radical: sloped armor that would deflect incoming fire, a diesel engine that would not explode, and a gun that could outmatch any enemy tank. It was an idea that promised survival through geometry and simplicity, but every decision carried a hidden cost. The alloy used for the hull was strong, yet brittle. The steel cracked under impact, shattering into deadly splinters that sliced through its own crew. The engine worked, but its designer was executed before it reached production. Mistakes were not tolerated. Perfection was mandatory, even if no one lived to achieve it. Inside the factories, workers labored under portraits of Stalin. Each stroke of the hammer a prayer for survival. A whisper of complaint could mean the gulag. A misplaced bolt could mean death. The T-34 was being born, not from innovation, but from terror disguised as progress. By 1940, the prototype was ready for its trial. In a brutal winter test, Koshkin drove it from Kharkov to Moscow himself, 1,000 kilometers through ice and mud to prove its strength. He coughed blood, fever rising, but refused to stop. When he arrived, the tank was frozen, but it moved. The party was impressed. The T-34 was approved for mass production. Weeks later, Koshkin died from pneumonia, never seeing his creation on the battlefield. His ashes were buried beneath the machine he gave his life for. And yet, the moment the first T-34 rolled off the assembly line, the clock began to tick. The Red Army had less than a year before Germany invaded. Factories rushed to meet impossible quotas. Armor plates were welded crooked. Engines were installed without proper testing. There was no time for precision. The motherland demanded results, not perfection. Each tank rolled out half-finished, but labeled ready for war. When the invasion came in June 1941, only 900 T-34s stood against the might of the Wehrmacht. They were powerful on paper, revolutionary by design, but the crews inside them had never trained in real combat. Their commanders had been purged, executed, or imprisoned years earlier. The T-34 was meant to be a sword of steel, yet it entered the war wielded by hands that trembled. In its birth, every bolt was forged from fear, every plate welded with desperation. And when those engines roared to life on the Eastern Front, they carried not just soldiers, but the ghosts of the men who built them. When the first T-34s met the German panzers in the summer of 1941, the world gasped. German shells bounced from its armor. Its gun tore through Panzer IIIs like paper. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed like an alien machine, low, fast, deadly. For a moment, the Red Army had created a monster that terrified even the masters of Blitzkrieg, but the terror would not last. What the outside world saw as invincible steel, the men inside knew as a trap. Each crewman stepped into a coffin disguised as a tank. There were no radios, only flags and shouts drowned by the roar of the engine. The commander was also the gunner, shouting orders as he aimed and loaded. The loader was often a boy, barely trained, sweating in the stench of diesel and cordite. And when the hatch slammed shut, they were cut off from the world outside. No light, no air, no chance. The turret was too small, stolen from a lighter prototype. It had space for 2 men when it needed 3. Inside, the walls closed in like jaws of metal. The commander could barely move his arms to reload. He had one periscope, a narrow slit that showed nothing but smoke. Every shot from the main gun shook the hull like an earthquake. Spent shells clanged at their feet. Oil dripped from the ceiling. The smell of fear mixed with gasoline. And when a shell hit the armor, not even a penetrating one, the steel itself betrayed them. The alloy shattered inward, flinging razor-sharp fragments through the crew. Eyes blinded, hands shredded, blood spraying across dials and levers. The tank might still move, but the men inside were already dying. 2 of every 3 never made it out when the tank burned. The hatch above was a single, heavy plate. To push it open, you needed strength no human had left after the blast. The driver's escape route faced forward, into the flames, so they burned where they sat, trapped by the very armor meant to save them. There was no mercy in those battles. German 88mm guns turned the Eastern Front into a slaughterhouse. From kilometers away, they punched holes clean through Soviet ranks. Crews tried to ram enemy guns when they ran out of shells. They used their tanks as battering rams, crushing cannons under treads before bursting into fire. Propaganda would later call it courage, but courage is not the same as choice. Most of them simply had no ammunition left. No orders, no hope, only the sound of their own engines screaming. The Soviets kept sending more. Factory after factory poured out tanks faster than men could be trained to drive them. New recruits received 72 hours of instruction, then straight to the front. They learned how to fire while the enemy fired back. They learned how to die before they learned how to fight. The Red Army's strength was never precision. It was endurance. When one T-34 burned, another took its place, and another, until the battlefield itself seemed to be built from their wrecks. Inside those burning hulks, voices screamed through radio silence. A few tanks had working sets. Most did not. Entire platoons charged blind, guided by flags flapping in the smoke. When one tank went up, the others didn't even know why. They followed anyway. Obedience was survival. Disobedience was treason. Better to burn for the motherland than face a firing squad behind the lines. This was the hidden truth of the T-34's legend. It wasn't invincible, it was expendable. Its power came not from superiority, but from sacrifice. Every improvement was written in blood. Every victory was measured in lives consumed. And while the world saw glory in its silhouette, the men inside saw only darkness, because for them, the war wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought inside a cage of steel where bravery ended and obedience began. By 1944, the Soviets had learned to fight like they were machines, cold, relentless, and unbreakable. But the war had changed. The Germans no longer feared the T-34. Their new Panthers and Tigers tore through its armor from miles away. The legend was dying, and the myth could no longer hide the truth. So the Soviets did what they always did. They built a new one. The T-34-85 was introduced not as a replacement, but as a resurrection. It looked similar, but beneath the surface, it was an admission of failure. The old turret was gone, replaced by one large enough for 3 men. At last, the commander had his own cupola, his own vision of the battlefield. A bigger gun, the 85mm, promised to pierce the armor of German tanks. Inside the propaganda reels, it was shown as rebirth, a phoenix of Soviet engineering rising from ashes of defeat. In truth, it was a compromise built under fire. Heavier, slower, cruder, but it gave the Red Army what it needed most: hope. Crews began to trust it again, not because it was perfect, but because it finally gave them a chance to live long enough to fire back. For the first time, some tanks carried working radios. The steel was thicker, the turret roomier. And yet, for every improvement, another cost emerged. The shells were larger, fewer could be carried. Fuel was short, oil thinner, supply lines stretched thin. The tank that was meant to liberate Europe crawled toward Berlin on the edge of collapse. Still, it fought. Through forests, through snow, through cities reduced to dust. Infantry clung to its sides as artillery thundered ahead. They rode it like a lifeboat through an ocean of fire. Each mile forward meant another graveyard behind. By 1945, thousands of T-34-85s rolled across Poland, Hungary, and Germany itself. To the west, it was a symbol of unstoppable Soviet might. To those who rode inside, it was the same steel cage with a different gun. When the war finally ended, few of them felt like victors. They had survived, but at a cost no one would ever calculate honestly. The legend lived on. Photographs of T-34s entering Berlin filled newspapers across the world. Children in Moscow drew them in classrooms. The party called it the tank that saved humanity. But the truth was simpler and harder to celebrate. The T-34 did not save humanity, it consumed it. It devoured a generation of boys and men, workers and engineers, all in the name of survival. Its story was not one of triumph, but of endurance beyond reason. Decades later, its silhouette still rolled through parades, painted fresh green under spring sunlight. Rust had been scrubbed away, bullet holes patched over. The myth was restored. The people were told once again to be proud. No one mentioned the purges that killed its creators. No one spoke of the crews who burned alive in its hulls. No one asked why the miracle machine had to be rebuilt halfway through the war. Because myths are easier to remember than truths. And the truth was too heavy to lift. Even as the Cold War began, the T-34 kept fighting. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Africa, in the Middle East. A ghost that refused to die, echoing across battlefields it was never meant to see. Somewhere in those deserts and jungles, men climbed into its shell for the last time, whispering prayers in languages Koshkin never knew. And, when the hatches closed, the silence inside sounded the same as it had in 1941. They called it immortal, and in a way it was, because myths never die. They are rebuilt, repainted, retold, until the blood dries and only the story remains. The T-34 became the story of an empire that mistook survival for victory and sacrifice for glory. It was never just a tank, it was a mirror, and if you look closely enough into that mirror, you might not like what looks back.